Good morning, everyone. My name is Valentina Bassich, and today I will be sharing the research I conducted as part of my master's dissertation at Imperial College London. My research is titled First Nation Astronomy as a Path to Decolonising Australian Museums, Challenges and Opportunities. And in this work, I examine how museums represent First Nations astronomy, how this can support effort to decolonise museum spaces, whilst also exploring the challenges and complexities involved in this process. Today I will start by outlining the context of my research. I will then explain my methodology and approach. I'll share my analysis and my findings, and I will end by discussing some possible ways of moving forward in this field. My research focuses on Australian museums, and Australia is a settler colonial country where the colonisers have never left, and as a result, power imbalances continue to shape public institutions, including museums themselves. So in this context, we should understand colonisation not just as an historical event, something that had a beginning and an end, but as an ongoing structure, as something systemic. So this context is important to understand the role of museums themselves. Museums are colonial institutions which were born during the height of the empire, and they played a key role in showcasing imperial power and achievement. They did so by appropriating objects, stripping them of their context, cataloguing, renaming them, and in doing so they erased First Nation cultures, worldviews and experiences. This practice of collecting objects, extracting them of their context and researching them promoted a hierarchy of knowledge, following which non-European worldviews were presented as inferior, as objects to be studied rather than as living, dynamic cultures. And in this way, museums contributed to the erasure of First Nation communities' worldviews, experiences, and voices. Much has changed since museums were first created. However, colonial frameworks still persist and still shape museum structures today. And in this context, decolonisation is a practice that critically examines this colonial foundation and works to disrupt them. There is no single agreed approach to what decolonisation should look like and how it should be achieved in museums, but in the past 3 decades there's a lot of work that has been done both in Australia and globally to address this, and specifically in the form of guidelines, policies, reports, which have started to shift how museums think about their practice and how they reflect about their colonial histories. A notable example of this is the 2018 Indigenous Roadmap Project, which is a 10-year plan developed by Terri Janke and Company for the Australian Museums and Gallery Association. And this project was designed to ensure that museums and galleries build a stronger relationship with Indigenous Australians and evolve away from the Eurocentric foundations. As part of this project, there were 3 documents that were created: a roadmap, a policy, and a report. And as part of the roadmap, one of its main recommendations, which was also the inspiration for this research, is to increase the representations of First Nation science within museums. 5 years after the publication of the Indigenous Roadmap Project, this research asks, how can representation of First Nations astronomy drive decolonising change in Australian museums, and what challenges are Australian museums facing as they decolonise their practice? In order to answer these questions, I conducted interviews with a small group of practitioners from leading institutions. One of this institution is the Powerhouse Museum on Gadigal country in New South Wales. And from this institution, I interviewed a curator and a visitor experience manager. Another institution which I contacted was the Gravity Discovery Centre on Noogal country in Western Australia. And there I spoke with the director of the centre and a Nooga elder from Whadjuk country, which is involved in developing and delivering First Nation astronomy programs. I also spoke with a professor of cultural astronomy as well. The institution were chosen because they were actively offering exhibition and programs on First Nation astronomy, and they were particularly involved with community engagement and representation. From the interviews, it emerged that there are 3 different layers at which museum decolonisation needs to happen, and these layers are deeply interconnected. These are decolonisation of knowledge, decolonisation of practice, and decolonization of audience engagement. And we're going to look into these themes separately. One of the key themes that emerged from the interviews was how museums define and represent First Nations astronomical knowledge. This raised the question of whether astronomy is an appropriate framework for museums to use when representing First Nations sky knowledge. From the discussion, a key tension emerged between representing First Nation knowledge on its own term and using familiar Western terms to engage audiences. So on one hand, using the term astronomy can be limiting because it prioritizes Western scientific frameworks. It extracts only part of First Nation sky knowledge, which unifies cultural belief and empirical observation, and places it into a Western category. This risks fragmenting the deeply interconnected knowledge, First Nation knowledge, and also risks reproducing knowledge hierarchies that decolonization seeks to disrupt. On the other hand, the term astronomy was also seen as a practical bridge for audiences. It helps museums connect with school curricula and therefore engage young people. And it also gives visitors an immediate point of reference, a point of reference they are familiar with. And that familiarity is seen as a potential doorway through which deeper cultural engagement and understanding can follow. So interviewees agreed on the existence of this tension, but they had different responses to it. Some interviewees proposed moving away from a traditional museum model, which relies on strict categories to organize knowledge, and instead they sort of envisioned a more holistic approach, where First Nation ways of knowing would guide how exhibitions are designed and presented. And following this vision, museum would move beyond dividing knowledge into fixed sections, fixed categories, and academic disciplines, and instead, visitors would explore interconnected themes in museums, allowing them to engage with knowledge as a network of relationship rather than isolated facts. Other people had a different view on this. They felt like while this holistic model should be a long-term goal, something we should aspire to, it requires a fundamental rethinking of how exhibitions are planned and interpreted, and as a result, it's still unclear what this might look like in practice. So for now, they argue that we should so value and continuing to use familiar Western frameworks strategically in order to engage audiences and gradually shift their perspective, with the aim of moving towards a more holistic museum and decolonized approach over time. The second layer of which colonization needs to happen within museums is practice. And across all interviews, two key principles for good practice came through very clearly. And this principle, which should guide a museum at an institutional level, needs to come across all areas of museums' work. So the first point which was highlighted is the need for First Nations leadership. Decision-making power, from acquisitions of objects to the choice of narrative in exhibitions and program design, needs to sit within First Nation staff and advisory bodies. So this leadership must be structurally embedded within the institutions. A second key point that emerged is the need for continuous community dialogue, meaning a sustained engagement with knowledge holders and not just a one-off consultation. So this ongoing dialogue maintains cultural accuracy, connection with communities, and hold institutions accountable. From here onwards, when we talk about practice, we're going to be focusing mostly on curatorial practice, which is the behind-the-scenes decisions that shapes how stories are told in exhibitions. So more specifically, curatorial work involves selecting objects for exhibition, arranging them in space, and deciding what information accompanies them, whether that's labels, images, or multimedia displays. And all these choices shape how audiences interpret the object and the stories that are being told. So a shared views that came through strongly with the interviews was that First Nation knowledge should be presented on its own terms in curatorial practice. And one common strategy that museums are used to approach this is parallel storytelling, where First Nations and Western narratives are developed separately and displayed side by side. While this avoids imposing a dominant Western framework, it can sometimes miss opportunities to show how these systems connect, or to address the power imbalances that have shaped these stories, especially when it comes to Western science. To address this, some practitioners are exploring ways to keep stories distinct while also highlighting points of connections between the two knowledge systems. So a promising example is a future project that the Gravity Discovery Center is undertaking, which will use a dual timeline of the universe to present Western cosmology and Nougat star knowledge alongside each other. Where the timelines overlap, the story will be told together, focusing on shared meanings and encouraging a deeper understanding of these knowledge systems. The goal is to center First Nations ways of knowing without isolating them and without reinforcing hierarchies of knowledge. So astronomy offers a strong entry point here as it engages visitors with big questions and it connects to different perspectives and knowledge systems. Although this approach is still evolving, it presents practical directions for museums to explore. So we now get to the third layer of which museum decolonization needs to happen, and this is the layer of audience engagement. Again, astronomy here plays a crucial role as an emotional and intellectual hook, helping audiences engage with the depth of First Nation knowledge and challenging misconceptions. However, there is a deeper tension here, for audiences often place a strong epistemic trust in science, viewing it as the ultimate source of quote-unquote objective knowledge. So when First Nation knowledge is presented under the label of astronomy, that trust is transferred to First Nation astronomical knowledge, helping it highlight its depth and complexity to the audiences. So on one hand, this can help shift public attitude, but on the other, it reinforces the problematic idea that First Nations knowledge needs validation through Western frameworks in order to be considered legitimate. So this is a fundamentally colonial notion which upholds knowledge hierarchies. So the idea that Western frameworks are the standards, and for other knowledge to be considered valid, they need to fit through these Western frameworks. So crucially, there is no solution which has been identified in order to move forward. However, one thing that emerged from the interview is that museums must keep reflecting critically on their practice. From this analysis, there is a fundamental tension that emerges. On one hand, there is a need to represent First Nation knowledge on its own terms, and on the other, there's a practical need to use Western frameworks to engage wider audiences. And this really captures the struggle at the heart of the decolonization process, which often has to operate within the very hierarchies and power structures it aims to dismantle. So some interviewees suggested that working within these frameworks might for now be a necessary step towards gradually moving to a more decolonial museum, one that represents knowledge holistically and focuses on connections rather than rigid categories. In this sense, representing First Nations astronomy can help open up these conversations and act as a catalyst for broader change. But it also highlights the ongoing tension that still needs to be navigated and addressed. There is no single path forward that was identified. However, decolonization must remain a continuous effort, a practice rather than a process, where museums constantly question their assumption and engage in an ongoing dialogue and center First Nation voices at every level. Thank you very much for your time.